All right. Hello and welcome to the second episode of Fitness Decoded. Today we are going to be talking about the link between nutrition and performance. Sorry, I have David muted right now. I need to unmute him. There we go. How's it going, David?
I'm pretty good, man. How are you?
Not too bad. All right. So, yeah, as I was saying, we're going to be talking about how nutrition is going to actually factor into not only athletic performance but just like general, like if you're going to the gym, if even if you're just like a regular athlete. So yeah, so we're going to be talking about kind of two topics today. It might end up actually being a bit of a two-parter. We might not be able to get through everything today because there's a lot of information, and I'm going to be letting David take the helm today just because this is a topic that he knows a lot about and has a lot to say about. So to kind of break it down for you guys, the two topics we're going to be talking about for sure are going to be calories, so balance, maintenance, all that fun stuff, as well as a little bit of macronutrients. I'm going to go over macronutrient kind of timing and amounts for your general athlete when it comes to competition and exercise. So I guess without further ado, David, where do you want to get started?
Okay, so I guess again, kind of restate what we're doing today. We're pretty much going to be giving some general nutrition guidelines for performance, physique, and just general health and overall. Matt, I don't know if you got my slides popped up on the screen, but if not, I'll just kind of continue myself over here.
I don't. I'm only putting pictures and graphs on the slide or on the
Okay,
screen.
no worries. Then I'll kind of just do my best to kind of make sure everybody kind of gets an idea of what I'm talking about for the most part. So, I guess kind of an intro today, we're going to give people some general ideas of how to structure your diet. This information is going to be pretty much applicable to athletes, your average gym goer, or if you're kind of just simply interested in general health and want an idea of where your, I guess, diet priorities or just intake priorities should kind of be allocated. Um, what we're going to primarily discuss, though, is going to be information that's kind of directed towards individuals who their primary goal is performing at a high level, whether it be a sport, physique, or other endeavor. Instead of, I guess, talking about what is optimal for health, we're going to be obviously talking about what is healthy because, again, we want our athletes to be healthy, but in some instances, we do some things where they are more directed towards performance than general overall health. So, our usual disclaimer, we're not necessarily experts on this. In fact, when I say necessarily, we're not, period, at all. However, we do have some general information that is supported by various studies and probably could be corroborated by your local dietitian or other expert. If you want to learn, specifics about your own diet, the first things I will say is experiment with yourself. Maybe use our recommendations, track progress, see what works best for you. That's kind of the only way you can kind of distinguish what does and what doesn't work, regardless of studies or what people tell you. My second recommendation is take maybe a look at the resources that we do mention every once in a while. And then finally, speak to a registered dietitian. They're the people who, they've gone to school, they're certified in what they talk about when it comes to giving like professional nutrition advice. So if that's the course you want to take, by all means go for it and follow their guidance because at least you have a professional backing up what you're doing. So let's first talk about the topics that we're going to cover today. Like Matt said earlier, we might not get to everything we were going to discuss. However, we will for sure cover calorie balance and macronutrients. Here I have pulled up something called it's a nutrition pyramid. The model that I have in front of me right now, I'm not sure if you guys can see it. Matt, do you have that pulled up?
I can, if you just give me 1 second here.
No worries.
I can't download this image.
No worries.
Hold on. What's it called? I can just download it from Google. Do you get it from Google?
No, I got it from an ebook. However, I would just say nutrition pyramid for body composition. And then if anything, RP Diet 2.0.
Okay. Just go ahead and explain it, and I will pull it up here.
Okay. So, anyways, if anybody was wondering, a lot of the information that I'm going to be providing, and I guess my aspect of the presentation, or just in general, is from Renaissance Periodization's RP Diet 2.0 book, a really good resource created by individuals who are very much more intelligent than me and Matt, and much well versed in the aspect of nutrition and just training in general. I take a lot of inspiration from what I do from them, so definitely check them out. They got, I think, coaching services, diet templates, training templates, all that type of fun stuff. So that's, I guess, my little plug for them. But the
Okay, it's up
pyramid
on the
that
screen.
I'm talking, you got it?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So if we look at the pyramid, it's kind of organized in order of least important to most important, with adherence kind of overlapping everything. So if we were going to break it down by percentage, calories would amount to about 50% of our total diet priorities in regards to its overall impact on your final results. Macronutrients, about 25%. Nutrient timing, so essentially when you eat your food in the day relative to, wake up, train, go to bed, 10%. Food composition is another 10%. And then supplement use and hydration, water, is the final 5. And I guess when we look at the other side of the pyramid, adherence, essentially it's kind of illustrated like that because adherence is the overarching, I guess, condition when it comes to your diet being successful. You can have everything kind of organized in order, all your, boxes checked off. However, if you're not actually adhering to your plan, then it was probably not a good plan to begin with. So regardless of how you space out the importance of all these different factors, if you don't adhere to what you've planned out, nothing's really going to happen, or at least not according to how you planned it to be. Another thing that I will say is this pyramid is more designed for, let's say, body composition, so building muscle, losing body fat, that type of stuff in mind. It's still very applicable, I would say, for athletes and for general population, people who are interested primarily in health. The only real change, I would say, would be to elevate food composition higher than nutrient timing and give it a little bit more importance, just because the quality of your food is definitely a big factor in regards to your overall health. But without further ado, we're going to kind of dive into calorie balance and explain exactly what calories are, why it's important, recommendations, and how exactly to establish how much you should be eating.
So I guess here's what we'll do. If you want to go over just generally what a calorie is, so you can explain that to people, and then what I'd like to do is I'm going to bring up just the calorie intake calculation and equation, just so we can get through it and at least provide a reference for, and so people can see, different people need different calorie intakes, and I'll put up the equation on screen so people can actually do it themselves if they're watching either live or on YouTube. Fitness Decoded on YouTube. Please subscribe. Okay, so yeah, go over what a calorie is, and then we'll get into just some basic BMR equations here, which I'll go over a little bit on that later.
All right. So again, calories represents about 50% of our total diet priorities. In regards to what a calorie is, it's essentially a unit of energy, and more specifically, it's the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of water by 1 degree. That may not mean anything to you. Didn't really mean anything too much to me when I first learned it, but that's essentially how it works. We acquire calories from the foods and liquids we consume, and our body requires essentially a minimum number of calories in order to function effectively, which is again going to depend on your activity levels, your genetics, and other external factors. If we were going to assign a name to that minimum number, it would be your basal metabolic rate, or essentially the number of calories your body requires to maintain its function and keep you alive if you essentially did nothing all day.
Yeah, so just your, base energy at a resting state, just doing nothing, how many calories your body needs just to literally, as David said, keep you alive.
Yeah. If we continue, would you want to get to that equation after, I guess, we talk about, why do we care about calories?
Yeah, we'll do that after.
Okay, so why do we care about calories? It's essentially our body's energy currency. We spend this currency in order to function and keep us alive. Where do we obtain our calories? Again, the body has 2 ways of doing this. We either consume foods, or the body has the ability to break down tissues in order to keep us alive in situations where we're not consuming enough. Body fat or adipose tissue is typically the go-to energy source the body will go to if it lacks sufficient calories over an extended period of time. But in some pretty extreme circumstances, such as famine, such severe calorie restriction can result in the body exhausting its adipose tissue's reserves, and moving directly towards skeletal muscle or just muscle mass, external muscle mass, biceps, all that fun stuff, as its main source of energy at that point. But again, that's like in instances of extreme famine, not necessarily something that we would run into in the Western world or any developed nation.
Right.
So
let's give ourselves a reference here. I'll put it up on screen, so I'll explain this a little bit. So as David was talking about before, your BMR, like we said before, that's going to be your basal metabolic rate, the amount of calories required to basically perform a function at a resting state. Why this is important so this is how we're going to do this is there's two figures here. So you have your BMR equation, which I have up on screen here. It's going to be a little bit different for men and women, and honestly, it's not even always going to be the same equation here. The one that I've decided to go with here, it's the one that I was taught to use, is the Harris-Benedict equation. But even this can change because this, as you can see, this one was revised in 1984. There's a whole bunch of different revisions. Like I said, this is just the one that I was taught to use. Most of them are going to give you very similar values. So just type in BMR equation if you're ever trying to find this. If not, then just remember Harris-Benedict equation. All of them should give you a general amount. So I think, unfortunately, my calculator actually died, so I'm kind of mad about this because
I got you.
Because this is so much easier to do with like a scientific calculator. But fortunately, I've already done this calculation, so I already know how many calories I need. So I'm just going to explain this for people, and David, if you want to do it yourself as well, just to kind of figure it out. Once we have this figure, what we're also going to do is multiply it by what's called an activity factor. What that means is just it's basically a multiplier based on how active you are. So whether you're completely sedentary, like if you just don't do anything during the day, then that would just be a multiply by 1. Like it's exact same value. But as you progress, like you get very little exercise, like medium amounts of exercise, and you're just like a professional athlete, all the way up into that higher ranges, your activity factor, your activity multiplier is going to increase. So let's get started with just calculating the BMR here. Again, this is going to be how much calories you're going to need just doing nothing. So you're going to take that 88 if you're a man. 88, we'll do men because both of us here are men. Sorry, ladies. But again, if you're a woman, just follow the woman equation here. But yeah, for men, it's going to be that 88.362. And now we're going to talk about weight in kilograms. If you don't know your weight in kilograms, because, depending on where you're from, kilograms or pounds might be the default denomination. For us, it's pounds, but if the easiest way to find out is to divide your weight in pounds by 2.2. That is how you convert from pounds to kilograms. The more you know. This is why we took math. So yeah, in the brackets, again, order of operations here, you're going to do the brackets, so 13.397 times your weight in kilograms, which is just going to be your weight in pounds, divided by 2.2. I'm going to leave this here. Obviously, I don't expect everyone to just be able to just do it like that. So again, if you're watching on YouTube, just pause the video if you're interested in doing that. If you're not, I guess skip ahead. Now from there, you're going to add your 4.799 times your height in centimeters. To this, honestly, I can't remember what the equation, David, do you know how to convert? Because I know for us, we do it's like feet and inches. Like I'd be 6'3", which is like 190 centimeters. I just Googled the conversion, so I mean, if you want to do that.
So did I. I wasn't.
I honestly.
Full disclosure to anyone else, there also are Harris-Benedict calculators online.
There are, yes.
I just used.
There are, yes.
However, you do probably want to go into a little description of the calculator to make sure it's using the correct formula.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of different revisions of the Harris-Benedict equation. So, like I said, I don't think they're all going to give you a very similar answer. But I guess if you really do want to be exact about how many calories you want, then just try and find the newest revised version of the Harris-Benedict.
I'm using one that was, I think, developed by 2 medical students and updated this past October. So
Okay.
I'll go with it, and I'll say it's relatively accurate.
I would say that's going to be accurate. So yeah, you're going to take your height in centimeters. If you don't know that, just honestly Google it because I don't know the conversion rate. And then you're going to you're going to subtract 5.677 times your age in years. That one's easy. We only calculate years in one metric. Okay, so following this equation, I came out to be actually I can't even remember what it was before the activity factor, so I'm gonna leave that. I'm gonna pull up the activity factor. So you're gonna take the number you got, your identical BMR. That's this whole equation here. Whatever number you got. Now we're gonna look into activity factors. So I'm gonna pull that up on the screen, and now you can see the different categories here. So it's gonna go from, depending on who you ask, the activity factor here can change. For me, I only have like 3 categories. I just used 4 categories. I just used sedentary, low, active, and very active, which is like a 1, a 1.12, a 1.27, and a 1.47. This is a little bit more in depth. I would say go with this one for sure, just because there are a little bit more categories here, and you might be able to identify, because somebody might not know the difference between sedentary and low activity. For reference, sedentary is you do nothing during the day. You just sit, which for some people might actually be their daily routine. So we're going to start here with the very light. So basically someone who is involved in minimal activities, like I said, just that sitting around, not doing a whole lot. And for men and women, that activity factor is going to be 1.3. Now what that means is you're going to take that BMR that we calculated. Where is it? Right there, the BMR that we calculated, and you're going to multiply it by that activity factor. And what that's going to give you is a rough idea. Obviously, this is not exact. It never will be, but it's going to give you a very somewhat accurate idea of how much calories your body needs to be able to function based on the stuff that you do. So, for reference, mine is around 2,700 calories, so 2,700 calories. What'd you get, David?
I'm looking at. I just put my activity factor to little or no exercise. Look, I took a little bit more than that, but
I
got
was gonna say you're a little bit more than that.
1,900 calories. That is if I did absolutely nothing all day.
So what about like what's your daily routine though? Let's factor in your daily routine. What does that give you?
Okay, so let's say it's a regular training week. I'd put that maybe hard exercise 4 to 5 times a week. We're looking at 2865.
2865. Okay. So, yeah, for reference, David is much smaller than me. Like,
Yes.
hold on. I was gonna say stand up, but we're in two separate cameras. But David, you're like what, 5'9"?
I'm 5'6", and I'm like about 150. I'm about 160 pounds right
Okay,
now.
yeah. So I'm almost like a foot taller than David, and about 120 pounds heavier than him. Yet,
Yes.
based on his activity level, he actually needs more calories than I do to be able to perform the tasks that he performs on a daily basis. So,
Essentially.
yeah, using that context, not everyone is going to require, like people say, oh, the average amount is 2,000. Sure, it's 2,000, but that's not even factoring in your activity factor, right? You always have to factor in that activity factor. That's going to give you a more accurate representation of the kind of calorie balance that you need to maintain throughout the day. So, hopefully everyone was able to calculate that.
I'll say one thing to the equation in regards to its accuracy. For myself, over the last while, I've kind of determined my own, at least at my current weight right now, my own maintenance calories probably lie somewhere between 1,900 and 2,100. So giving me a, 1,900 levels of calories of if I was absolutely sedentary is actually not too far off.
That's pretty much the average, right?
Yeah,
it's around that 2,000.
What I would.
And I was around there too, because I think I was maybe like 2,100, which is slightly over it.
So yeah, the BMR or the Harris-Benedict equation, we could probably say is a fairly good place to maybe start to get to know your body if you've never tracked calories over an extended period of time.
Yeah. All right, so let's just go into calories and body composition.
Sure. So when we talk about body composition, at least in general fitness terms, we're kind of referring to how much muscle and body fat your body is made of, specifically maybe the ratio of adipose tissue to skeletal muscle, which is, visible muscle that we see. Usually, when we talk about improving composition from a health and physique standpoint, we're referring to reducing adipose tissue or body fat and increasing muscle mass or skeletal muscle. With this in mind, calorie manipulation is the most important factor in regards to weight gain or weight loss. And if I was going to be a little bit more, I guess, specific about the terms, muscle increase in muscle mass and a reduction in body fat. Let's move over to calories and overall energy balance. So there's three states to note when thinking about calories and energy balance. We have isocaloric or maintenance, hypocaloric or a calorie deficit, or hypercaloric or a calorie surplus. So if we're going to go through all three, let's start off with isocaloric or maintenance. It's essentially your body's in a state where the ratio of calories being consumed is versus being expended or being used up. So money you're putting in versus money you're taking out are essentially the same. And this is going to result in extended periods of body weight maintenance. It may not be exact maintenance, but you're kind of within a certain resting point and you're not moving too far away from there unless you're trying. And if you're trying, then we might be looking at a hypocaloric calorie deficit. And just to note, hypo, that's the term that we use for
it's usually it's like a deficit of something. Like we talk about hypooxygenated blood, that is blood that does not have oxygen in it, and we talk about hyperoxygenated blood, that's blood that does. Or a term that probably people are more familiar with is going to be hypothermia, right? That deficit of heat, if you want to put it simply. So
I was going to say hypoglycemia for people who have like diabetes and stuff, or hyperglycemia.
Just to remember, hypo, missing, hyper, more, or deficit and surplus, if you want to use more technical terms.
So, our calorie deficit or hypocaloric state, the body's in a state where it's not getting enough calories to meet energy needs, and it has to break down its own tissues to do so. This is really going to result in a weight loss over an extended period of time. Excuse me. Now, when we look at hypercaloric states or calorie surplus, the body's in a state where it's getting more than enough calories to meet energy needs, and it needs to store this excess energy, typically as body fat. This results in weight gain over an extended period of time. So, let's move over and take a quick sidestep to kind of human physiology and calorie usage slash storage. This may not make too much sense right now, but trust me, as we kind of get deeper into this conversation, it's going to make a lot more and kind of add up. Due to our, human physiology and a couple million years of evolution, give or take, we have developed to prefer body fat as a preferred method of storing excess energy calories. What I mean by that is if within any state we were ever in a calorie surplus, the preferred way the body wants to take that energy and put it away is as body fat. Why? Well, body fat requires less energy to build and maintain than skeletal muscle, or just muscle mass in general, which would have reduced overall survival chances during the early centuries of human existence. So, I guess to the next point, actually, it would make more sense to explain this before I go into that. It's only when the body is exposed to some type of external stress, typically high amounts of load or weights, as we would see now, like going to the gym and stuff like that, do we see increases in muscle mass. This effect can be pretty much enhanced by a steady calorie surplus or adequate protein. So, the main takeaway point from here, it's very easy to obtain body fat as well as to lose it. And the reason for that is that's just the more efficient way of the body, that's the more efficient pathway for the body to, I guess, have energy readily available if there were ever famine or some type of situation where there wouldn't be enough energy available. And in ancient times, that was a lot more concerning because you would go through times of plenty of food and then pretty much starvation in some instances. So your body would be pretty much adding body fat just to kind of hold on to whatever period where you're lacking calories, instead of putting it to muscle mass, because it takes a lot more work to maintain that. And at that point in history, it just wasn't advantageous for survival. Now, we intentionally, in our modern world, things are a little bit more comfortable. Now, we're intentionally adding some type of stress to the body because we want those excess calories to be muscle mass instead of body fat. and we need some type of stimulus, which is usually weight training,
Right.
to do so.
And just to
So
quickly add on to that, if we talk about fat loss and fat gain over history, part of the reason why we in the 21st century are experiencing, I guess, epidemic of obesity. Obviously, there's all your cultural causes, the rise of fast food, convenience, all that fun stuff. But I guess going back into history, like your body doesn't get fat because it hates you. Your body gets fat as a survival mechanism, right? It's for insulation. We use fat for all kinds of bodily functions. The problem now is the problems we used to face, we no longer face. We don't need that level of fat for insulation. This is why your body sort of craves those fatty foods, or at least is more
inclined.
Agreeable to those kinds of foods, because it's like we're still hardwired to want those kinds of foods because our body still thinks we need it to survive. Obviously, with how things are with modern day life, we don't need that fat to survive anymore, but we need to be able to kind of fight against our body and say, listen, you don't need to fatten us up anymore. We don't have to live through a winter with no heat, no insulation. Like, we're good. We got heated homes now. We're doing okay.
Yeah.
We got Canada Goose jackets. We're doing all right.
We got not even just simply the cold, but also even just periods of just lack of food.
Exactly.
We don't really have that too much now. You essentially, in very extreme cases, will you go hungry, but if you do go hungry, in fact, this is a very extreme example, but if we look at Nazi internment camps, when we look at people when they would go in versus come out, they would come out extremely skinny, right to the bone, and in those instances, that is where their body had to rely on any adipose tissue in order to survive, because they essentially were given essentially nothing to eat.
Yeah.
So that is probably the most, at least that I can think of, the most, I guess, applicable modern example of what your body will do to try and keep you alive. So, Matt, do you have anything else to add to that?
Not particularly. You mentioned it's just as easy to gain weight as it is to lose weight. But I
guess I want to clarify that.
Yeah.
The weight, I mean, it's easy to gain body fat, and it's easy to lose body fat in comparison to muscle mass.
Right.
Muscle mass takes a long time to accumulate, and to a certain extent, it does take a little bit more inactivity and lack of use to lose. However, not anywhere as comparable to how easy it is to expend through body fat.
Right. Okay, makes sense.
And again, the reason is because that is the body will, as I stated previously, only through extreme examples do we see the body start to go through its reserves of skeletal muscle, because its first pathway, or after glucose or carbohydrate, which we'll talk about later, its secondary pathway is adipose tissue or fat, and then its final pathway is skeletal muscle. That is why the body will more be inclined to burn through adipose tissue, body fat, and then move to skeletal muscle.
Right.
So just, I guess, sum it up, easy to gain body fat because your body prefers to store it than actually use it as fuel, and easy to lose to a certain extent in comparison to skeletal muscle, because the body, that's essentially what body fat is there for, aside from hormonal function and being nice little insulators, or not insulators, but cushions for joints, and a bunch of other factors keeping you functioning well. So, are we good to go?
Yep, let's move on.
Okay, so common question I think any personal trainer or fitness professional is ever going to face is people coming up to you saying, listen, my goal is to get big and be lean at the same time. And honestly, I don't blame them. Why not? Is that essentially, well, for most standards in regards to aesthetics and health and stuff like that, having more skeletal muscle and less adipose tissue is pretty ideal. Why don't we do it at the same time? Well, I'm going to address that. In some individuals, this, what we would refer to as body composition, is possible, but it does only occur in specific populations and for only select periods of time. So the three instances where it occurs are individuals who are completely new to resistance training or formal dieting. I would say anybody who has less than 1 to 1.5 years of formal training and dieting can experience what we would call newbie gains, where we get rapid amounts of skeletal muscle being built up and strength being accumulated, especially in individuals who are, I don't want to say overfat, but have higher levels, plus 20% plus 30% plus body fat. And the reason for that is because it's such a new and novel stimulus, the body is much more inclined to start using all this perhaps excess body fat. And let's say if it's a leaner individual, because it's such a new stimulus, the body realizes, oh, we have to adapt to this very quickly, so let's get a move on. And that's where we see these rapid increases in strength and muscle mass. Two,
sorry, just to add on to that, that's your theory of diminishing returns, which is, I guess, also, can be sometimes also a spirit killer, because you notice those immediate gains and those quick gains and you feel good, and then all of a sudden it slows down, you're going to the gym and you're not getting those gains anymore, and that's probably one of the leading reasons why people just give up, right? They stop seeing that, they stop feeling good, because they're not seeing that, but that's normal, that's natural, that's going to happen, it always happens. You're not always going to have the same rate of progress when it comes to muscle building and weight loss. It's going to be the same principle.
Essentially, in fact, for myself, in my first year of training, I probably went from either 120 to 125 all the way up to maybe 135 pounds.
Okay.
With just training, no idea when it came to my diet, and now I've accumulated all the way to where my resting weight is somewhere between 155 and 160 pounds over the span of 3.5, 4-ish years. So, slow process that keeps slowing down as you get older, but that's how it is. So, our second scenario, as I was saying, is resistance-trained individuals who have taken an extended period of time away from lifting weights. Some degree of recomposition can occur. The easiest way that I guess we could simplify it is because of muscle memory. Not so much muscle memory, but your body has already, I guess, created certain pathways, neurological, physiological pathways, that it doesn't necessarily have to repeat in order to get the same adaptions, because it's been exposed to it in the past. So some recomp can occur, but it's a little bit more iffy, if we're going to say, in the evidence-based community. And then a final example, I think maybe some people would have guessed, people who use performance-enhancing drugs, various different substances that professional athletes, professional bodybuilders will use that enhances certain effects of, like, some thermogenic effects when it comes to reducing body fat, putting on abnormal amounts of muscle mass that a normal individual wouldn't be able to handle.
Right.
That's the best way to say it. So we have to keep in mind that the physiological processes for building muscle and losing fat under normal conditions are diametrically opposed to each other. So here we're moving away from individuals who can body recomp. Let's say you've done your 1.5 years of training, you're done your newbie gains, and now we're in the big leagues. Now things are much slower and more difficult. So, as I stated, building muscle and losing body fat, again, diametrically opposed. One requires a calorie surplus and promotes better recovery, more muscle mass, better strength, better performance, a bunch of different things, while also accumulating a little bit of body fat as well, kind of inevitable. While the other one kind of does the opposite. Your strength goes down, your strength performance in the gym, your body fat levels go down, some aspects of hormonal stuff goes down as well, sleep can get irritated for an extended period of time, but you get leaner.
Right.
And in some instances, can be very important for individuals who have accumulated too much body fat. So either or, there's no bad or good, they're just opposed, essentially. So once you've reached this stage where you can't be doing both at the same time, you kind of have to pick a path as to what in regards to your body composition. You can find this out by using different methods of assessing body fat, skin fold calipers, bod pod. I don't know why I'm blanking on this. I literally had a unit in my class about this.
Body fat, I would say...
bioelectrical impedance, even though it's not the most accurate.
depending on which one you use, so
Yeah.
your typical one you'll find at the
Oh,
gym is not very accurate.
yeah. DEXA scan, which I believe is probably the most accurate, if I'm not mistaken.
Dexa or bod pod, I think, are going to be the
Yeah.
two most. Is it worth explaining what those are? Most people are not going to have access to a bod pod or a Dexa scan.
Yeah. Unless you are some type of
Like
elite athlete or
yes,
you.
unless you have access to those kind of facilities, whether you're a an exercise physiologist or an elite athlete who really needs that kind of stuff. But for the general masses, um, looking for body fat composition, it's just going to be like skin fold. If you do that as an assessment with a trainer, they're likely going to be doing skin fold with you.
Most likely.
I haven't done any with clients because it's not really what I do. Um, but yeah, and then bioelectrical impedance, there are good ones, but the problem with those is there's a whole bunch of different factors that can skew your results. For example, your hydration level. Um, there's just basically what that is. It's just like shoots like a shock of electricity through like one point in your body, through your body, and then out the other side. So it's usually done by like standing on something. There's actually scales that have
Yeah.
bioelectrical
Yeah. There's a
impedance on
couple.
them. So it just shoots in through one foot and comes down the other. There's also the most common one you'll find at the gyms are the ones that you just like hold with two hands. Those are again, they're okay, but there are going to be different factors that are going to skew your results a little bit. So I would say
I guess.
probably skin folds are the easiest, most accessible and accurate ones you could do.
Yeah. I guess for general practitioner, for general population, I would say for most individuals, if it's extreme enough, you'd probably go see your doctor. If you believe you have too much adipose tissue or not enough, but for general population, I think we can probably tell looking in the mirror a little bit sometimes if we think we need to put on a little bit of mass or lose some body fat.
Yeah.
But in regards to this conversation, that's not where we're not really discussing guidelines. There are body fat distributions in regards to health, but that's not what we're talking about today. That's something for, I guess, the audience to kind of determine what they want. We're just going to be talking about why things work and how to get to a certain, I guess, place that you want.
Right.
So now that we've kind of determined that we can either body recomposition if you fall into those three categories. Um, Ideally, I don't think we'd have anybody who are on PEDs listening to our podcast, but if we do, welcome. And we've determined that we either have to pick most likely. Well, I forgot. There's also the middle route, just simply maintaining your weight as well, in regards to putting on size and reducing body fat. Let's move on to calories and performance. So this is for our athletes. Why, as an athlete, would you care about calories? And the three main factors I guess we're going to discuss here are calorie intake affects sport performance by determining energy availability. So just from your calories, how much energy you have to do your sport or your daily activities. Facilitating recovery, so how well you can recover for your training or general activities, and influencing body composition in general. Matt, by all means, jump in whenever you feel like you got something else to add in. So,
Sorry, I just had a minor technical blip. You were frozen, but I fixed it. We're good.
oh, okay. So let's first talk about determining energy availability. Again, as we discussed earlier, calories are what fuel your body. As an athlete, you practically pretty much want a sufficient flow of energy for optimal performance when you are, participating in your sport and just your life in general. You live a fairly active lifestyle. You need to be fueling yourself to make sure you can perform at your best ability.
Yep.
So, if you're an athlete, you might be thinking, wait, why doesn't my body just tap into my fat tissue and use that for exercise? I'm wasting all this time eating all this extra food when my body has energy it can tap into on its own, and it saves so much time because I'm so busy all the time. Fair question. However, first, there's 3 points that I guess I'd counter that with, is you need to be eating enough calories to begin with to accumulate enough fat tissue for the body to use. Not the best rebuttal, but I guess it kind of works for this little thought experiment. Number 2, the body takes about 2 hours of continuous exercise before body fat becomes its primary fuel source for exercise. Most athletes usually don't get to this point during formal exercise unless you're an endurance athlete. Then you have somewhat of a point, but there are better ways of going about getting at that energy than just, I guess, exercising yourself into needing to. The third point is glucose or glycogen, which is the absorbed / the stored form of carbohydrate, which is a macronutrient we'll be talking about a little bit later, are the body's ideal fuel source when it comes, which we primarily get from eating certain foods, them being carbohydrates. The take home point here is chronically under eating and relying on your body's stored tissues pretty much results in suboptimal performance for both sport and life in general. For this fact, I don't think there's any real sport professionals or respected sport professionals that would probably disagree with that fact right there. That being in a chronic calorie deficit is going to be pretty bad for your overall performance and probably quality of life in general. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Not too much. If we just talk about using, if we're still on fat, right? Yeah. So using fat, and we talked a little bit about glucose and glycogen, which is our main, carbohydrates. I would say energy source, right? If we want to just talk about, I'll kind of diverge here into like general weight loss theory, and energy systems and what we burn when we do stuff. So like the first thing, I guess, the body, when we're in that anaerobic state, which is that somewhat high intensity, which we usually typically don't recommend for weight loss, because at that point we are using that glucose and that glycogen as our primary fuel source. Once we get into that more prolonged aerobic activity, that's why they usually recommend like medium intensity aerobic activity over a prolonged period of time for weight loss. That's when the body's starting to chews through past those carbs and it's hitting that fat, right? That's when we start using fat as a fuel source. And then, I mean, if you want to bring protein into it, ideally your body should never be using protein as a fuel source, because that's, when it starts to eat away at your muscles, which that is when you are out of fat and out of carbohydrates. And again, that's that starvation scenario. That's why people do start to lose muscle mass, because it's your body just uses whatever it has. And if protein and muscle is the only thing it has left, it's going to use it. But yeah, you never want to be in a situation where your body is primarily using protein to fuel its exercise, right? You want to, ideally, if you're like an athlete or even a power athlete, you want to stay within that carbohydrates being used, especially if you are trying to maintain a set body weight. You don't want to be losing or gaining too much fat. I wouldn't even recommend going into that. As David said, like 2 hours of continuous exercise before body fat becomes that primary fuel. So yeah, if you are looking for weight loss, that 2 hours of continuous, I would say, because no one's going to do continuous high intensity, or most people, especially if they are in that weight loss category, are going to be doing even medium intensity for like 2 hours. Most people are, they run at like a 5 on a treadmill and for maybe 45 minutes and they're done, which there's nothing wrong with that. Again, you are hitting that low to medium intensity prolonged weight loss fat burning activity. That's really all I had to add to that.
Yeah, by technicality, yeah. If your goal is I'm going to burn the most amount of body fat, you can run, do 2 hours of continuous activity in theory, but in practicality and time management doesn't necessarily play out in practice. And we'll touch that a little bit later.
Right.
So our second point to why calories are important: facilitating recovery. Aside from performance, when we think about training, regardless of the sport, there's a continuous process of tissue breakdown, healing, and under the right conditions, we adapt and we get some stronger and bigger tissues, whether that be stronger tendons, ligaments, or just general skeletal muscle in general. This tissue healing / adaptation process requires energy in the form of calories. If we're chronically under eating, the body is going to prioritize those calories to your basic bodily functions. We spoke about BMR earlier. It's not necessarily in a BMR state, but the body's going to take those calories, make sure all your necessary bodily functions to keep you alive are addressed first, and then if there's enough money left in the bank, it'll pay those extra bills, those bills being any tissue repair adaptations that are left to address. And in some instances, it's going to be just super slow, which isn't a massive deal unless you're an elite athlete, then you want to be as optimized and as healed as always. Or in a worse scenario, no tissue repair occurs and you're kind of in a chronically damaged state, which can eventually result in injury and not so fun stuff.
Right.
In contrast, if you're in a calorie surplus, or at least maybe isocaloric or near isocaloric, this provides the necessary resources for tissue repair and the ability to recover, which if you're an athlete, this is essentially what you want to be doing throughout your entire career to make sure you actually have an extended period of playing your sport or doing whatever you want to do. Anything to add to that, Matt?
Not really. I feel
Okay.
like at this point I'm the fun fact machine. I just spit out
Okay.
fun,
All right.
interesting additions, but keep going. You're doing good.
Our third one is influencing body composition, which for some athletes we can maybe see in professional sports. Some athletes, perhaps depending on the sport, don't necessarily have the best body composition, or to be quite frank, maybe get a little bit too over fat in the off season, or even underweight in the off season if whatever the nutrition their dietitian isn't or their sports team isn't managing correctly. But if you are an average athlete, you don't really necessarily always have that support network. So being informed is your best defense against being out of shape. Um, as we said earlier, calories have a pretty direct effect on body weight, which can heavily influence an athlete's athletic ability and your overall competitiveness. For some sports, possessing a greater amount of mass is kind of required to be competitive. Let's say football, some team sports, maybe some power sports as well. You have to be big to a certain extent to be successful, depending on your position, depending on your role. So it would probably be in your best interest to be in a surplus or at least maintenance for an extended period of time to make sure you can actually compete in your sport. Some athletes, though, they thrive within a certain weight range and have no benefit of being heavier, so it'd be wise for them to ensure they don't become too heavy for their sport or, in contrast, too light for their sport. If I could think, sprinters, some endurance athletes, the reason they're so thin, well, aside from just the general nature of their sport, they thrive in that lighter. It's better for them to carry less mass than they absolutely fundamentally need to be good at their sport. Otherwise, their run times and other factors kind of just go down. And then I completely forgot to put this on my slides, but just athletes who have to fit within weight caps, powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, even bodybuilders to a certain extent. You have to make weight. Oh, wrestlers, boxers,
MMA
stuff like that.
fighters, combat
Yeah,
sports, stuff like that.
you need to make weight. So having a good idea of your overall caloric intake, because again, it's the biggest influencer when it comes to your body composition and thus your weight, is pretty important to make sure that you are even able to compete at all. So that is why as an athlete you should definitely take a look at your caloric intake to make sure it's under control. Matt, you got anything else to like anecdotal, anything experience with athletes when it comes to maintaining body weight challenges?
So not necessarily with other people, but if we go back into, I guess, my athletic history, being a sprinter, to be honest, when I was training, I didn't put any thought into sort of body weight and nutrition and all that stuff. For me, it was just purely, train intervals, get faster. But I mean, I was still young. I was still a kid. Not saying youth has any other factor as opposed to being an adult athlete, but I do think, so I'm trying to remember what my weight was back then. So that had to have been a good like at least 6 years ago now. Maybe I was probably around. I haven't really grown since then, so I would say like 6'3", 180. So yeah, that sort of. I was very lanky then too. The only muscles I had was in my legs because honestly I didn't see any value in training my upper body as a sprinter, which obviously being an athletic trainer now, I see there is value in that. And anyone who asks for my advice, I do tell them, make sure, obviously it's not as important, but again, make sure your body is working in harmony. So that's training all parts as well as maintaining that caloric balance. But yeah, I think for youth athletes that I've worked with, and I've worked with quite a few now, we'll probably end up going to this in maybe even a different topic, but we talk about their diet. And honestly, well, this is more, I guess, applicable, and I think I'm going off on a tangent here, applicable to the macro information that we're going to get to here in just a second. But making sure that diet is at least consistent if you are trying to go for that either surplus deficit or weight balance, right? And I don't ever see a lot of that, especially in youth athletes, because they just kind of eat whatever they want. And it's not something that really comes up. But I think the more that I've learned about nutrition, from what we've talked about so far, and from things we've talked about in the past, is I'm gonna if I do start getting back into that, is kind of enforcing more of caloric, I guess, training method.
Control,
Yeah,
I guess you could,
control.
at least at the very minimum, at least control.
just
You
just
know,
just being aware of it, knowing at least what state you're in and how it's
yeah,
going to affect your performance. Like a lot of the athletes that I like to work with are power athletes, so I would say either I would say just being in a balance state is probably going to be the best for them. I wouldn't recommend going into surplus. I don't work with any lifters, any combat sports, any of that stuff. So I know you do. So I imagine in your advice you probably do give some some surplus recommendations, I would assume.
for sure. I have one of my friends. He's a little lankier. Shout out Roberto. We need to get. We with him we started really working on trying to get him to increase his caloric intake. But even with clients, just the main thing is just getting something steady going. You
Right.
know, for me, when I played soccer, my diet was always steady because I was lucky enough to my mom would she's a stay-at-home mom and she'd pretty much cook the exact same thing consistently for as long as I can honestly remember. So when I started getting into like bodybuilding, and even now where she still cooks a certain percentage of my meals and stuff like that when I'm a little bit busy, I'm lucky to be able to essentially have very steady control over what I eat, and I'm also a very non-picky eater, so I my diet probably sticks 85% to the plan. The other 15% is probably just eating out with my girlfriend, and now that it's COVID time, that's maybe dropped to like 5%.
Right.
So
I think even
for
like my
sorry,
my
go ahead.
diet, like when I was competing, like living at home, definitely helped me a lot. Just
Yeah.
based on the kind of food that I was eating. We never had any, I guess you'd call it junk food. It was always just healthy, balanced meals, um, which I think that's probably the biggest difference I've noticed. And now looking back on it, I think that was definitely a huge contributor to my good performance in my sport. That is also something that I don't see in a lot of youth athletes as well. Having worked with them, like they do have poor diets, some of them, and you can definitely see it. I can see it in their performance, in their training results. The results are
Yeah.
there. So just at least being aware of where you
Yeah.
are with your calorie intake, right?
Yeah. Aside from performance, just in general, especially for young athletes, eventually, you're gonna have to take care of yourself. So why not we start developing these skills a little bit earlier in life?
Yeah.
We don't have to take them to the regimen to like a similar regimen as like a bodybuilder in regards to calorie tracking and strictness, but at least being aware that like, hey, if I'm good enough, I might be able to get away with it. But to be the best, I have to be on point.
I was very much in the camp of I'm good enough. I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. Like I can just do whatever I want and still win.
Yeah.
Until I stopped winning, and then I was kind of like, damn, I really gotta figure out like using all the tools. Just because you can get by on the bare minimum doesn't mean you should be
Yeah.
living by the bare minimum. Using all the tools available to you to maximize your performance, maximize your success.
Yeah. All right. So now that I guess we've kind of covered exactly why all of you athletes listening or who listen afterwards should be caring about our calories, let's shift to how do I determine where my calories should be sitting at according to my goals. Of course, we used our Harris-Benedict equation, which can always be used to, I guess, get a good starting base to where we
So
can
it's a
move from.
baseline.
Yeah, essentially just a baseline. I've used some other methods with people. I've used other methods with myself. Um, Something also to consider is again those calculators don't always factor in your body size, formal exercise, stress, genetics, body fat percentage, stuff like that. Some do, but something that I've found that works fairly well is simply tracking your calories over an extended period of time, 5 to 7 days, probably as the minimum, while eating how you would normally eat. So, how do we go about this? Almost anybody, you can go on Amazon. You can find a little food calculator, a food scale.
Food scale.
Uh, Again, lucky enough, I live in a household with very simple, stable food all the time. For people who live alone, or if you live in households where maybe the food's just a little bit more too complicated to weigh out individually, it can be a little bit challenging, but again, do your best to try and weigh it out, figure out what you're eating. There's lots of different apps that you can use when it comes to tracking calories for your phone, computer, whatever you got. You can track them manually if you want, but I don't really recommend it. Two that I'll plug right now are MyFitnessPal. I still use the free one. It's an Under Armour. In fact, I don't even know if Under Armour owns it anymore. I don't think so. I think they
I'm
sold it
not
off.
sure, but everyone I know uses that
Yeah,
one.
MyFitnessPal is free. You can get the paid version, but from something coming from somebody who bodybuilds quite frequently, I've never really found too much of a need for it, unless you want very specific details. Other than that, the RP Strength Diet app I plugged earlier, that one actually has some customization and it can actually provide your calories for you and some macros according to how you respond weight wise. And from what I understand, it's pretty good, pretty up there in the App Store. So if you want that one's paid, so I think it's a $20 a month subscription. I've never used it personally, but I've heard some pretty good things
$20
from it.
a month though. That's a bit steep.
It is steep, but from what I understand, the AI is really good. So
That's fair.
that's up to your own, I guess, the listener's discretion if you want a little bit of extra help and skipping over maybe some of the trial stuff. But again, 5 to 7 days, track on an app, weigh out your food as best as you can. Those databases, they also have barcode scanners. Sorry, those apps have barcode scanners, so you can scan in food and kind of select the portion size as well, which is pretty convenient. So we've tracked for 5 to 7 days. Let's say we did our BMR calculator as well. We might want to compare to see what we're looking at. Whether you found that you ate over, under, or at your estimated range. Again, this is all just kind of a hypothesis to begin with. Ideally, on the very first day or the night before you started tracking, you weighed yourself first thing in the morning after you used the washroom. This is probably going to provide our most accurate representation of your weight because we haven't accumulated any food weight, any water weight, any other things entering our body. After you've tracked your calories for however many number of days you track for, weigh yourself again. Excuse me. Ideally under as similar conditions as you can replicate. Similar meal the night before, similar amount of sleep at best, similar stool size too, which for some people, myself sometimes, can be quite difficult to do, but as best as you can.
Why is that, David?
Something, huh?
Why is that?
Sometimes I just eat shit, man. sometimes my poops just aren't moving well. So ideally,
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I do eat quite a bit, but it's yeah, especially with quarantine where steps are low. But anyways, some things to consider when we're determining how accurate our weigh-in is would be a high amount of sodium, carbohydrate the night before, caffeine, and any other substance that kind of interrupts water balance, I would say. Sodium's a big one. It can really influence how much water you're retaining. Carbohydrates, I believe 1 gram of carbohydrate stores 3 grams of water. If you are obsessive enough to do the calculation of how many carbs to water the night before, by all means, I think that's a little excessive, but you can do it. And caffeine is also a diuretic, so that can also influence what's going on. But again, in general, even unhealthier meals the night before that are very heavy can pretty much skew and make a weigh-in obsolete, I would say. In fact, in some instances, weighing every single day and taking an average of what you were is maybe a better way of determining accuracy. However, if it can be pretty psychologically tough for some people to go through, which is understandable. So, at best, try and simulate the same conditions, similar meal, and go with that. So, you've done that. You've done your weigh-in, and you've determined, okay, this weigh-in is fairly accurate as I can say it is. So, depending on if you gained, lost, or maintained weight, will determine if you're in a surplus, deficit, or you're at maintenance or caloric. Keep in mind, weight fluctuations over an extended period of time are probably more valid. So, just remember this multi-day experiment is just a hypothesis and can kind of give you just a general idea of how your body responds to your... Oh, in fact, I forgot to mention, throughout this period, you want to be eating like you would normally do, because this kind of gives an idea of what your body is actually accustomed to eating, which in some cases BMR calculators just don't really take into account.
Yeah.
Some people, their BMR is skewed for whatever reason, genetics, lifestyle, stuff like that. So they might actually need a lot less calories than somebody else who's the exact same weight as them. Completely common all the time. So again, maybe compare this to your BMR, see where you line up, and use it as a rough starting point. I guess performing your own little experiment to see where your body lines up. Matt, you got anything to add to it before I hop to the next part?
So a little tidbit of information, like I said, for most of this, I'm the fun fact guy. We talked about water balance, and sort of diuretics and stuff like that. For reference, I'm going to use caffeine here because I know the values for caffeine. 100 or so, like 1 milligram of caffeine is equivalent to 1 milliliter of water loss from the body. So let's say you're taking 100 milligrams of caffeine, your body is losing 100 milligrams or 100 milliliters of water. And like to sort of put that into more applicable sense, we drink a cup of coffee, so 250 milliliters, right, of liquid, where maybe let's say 135 is caffeine. So you've got 250 milliliters of coffee, 135 milligrams of caffeine in said coffee. That's going to affect the net water gain, right? Because you are ingesting liquids, but caffeine is taking some of that out. So to just kind of figure that out, you got your 250 mils of liquid minus, again, is that 1-to-1 ratio between caffeine and water. So that minus 135 milliliters of caffeine. So your net water gain is actually only 115 milliliters of water. So in that 250 milliliters of water or of fluid that you are ingesting, caffeine and I think some other diuretics are also going to cause that water gain to actually be a little bit less than what you might think. So always just kind of being aware of different things that can affect your fluid balance. That's all I had for that.
And that's honestly sometimes it's the most difficult thing when trying to regard if a weigh-in is accurate or not.
Yep.
Trying to remember back the night before, because in some instances sodium, like keeping track of your sodium can be rather difficult because some foods just have added sodium for whatever reason in high amounts. So it can get tough sometimes getting an idea of what your water balance is looking like.
Yeah.
Feeling bloated is honestly sometimes a pretty good indication, but that can be also some other things as well. So, all right, guys. So we've gotten our weigh-in. We have a rough number of where we're sitting at, whether we're in a surplus, isocaloric, or in a deficit. Now, how do I make adjustments? And this is what we're going to touch on next. Now that we have a baseline number, we can start hypothesizing how we want to move up or down or stay the same. A pretty important figure to keep in mind is 3,500 calories is 1 pound of tissue. And that tissue can be muscle or fat. So we can break this number down. So 3,500 equals 1 pound of tissue. We can, I guess, take into account that there's 7 days, seven days in the week. If we take that 3,500 and we divide it by 7, we get 500 calories per day. And we can kind of quantify that as 1 pound of tissue is equal to 7 days of being in a surplus or a deficit. So with that, you can kind of start organizing how your diet would function. And again, now that we have this ratio, you can play around with it. Let's say you don't want to gain 1 pound or one pound or up or down, gained or lost. Let's say you want to do 0.75 pounds. You can do that. Do the calculation. 0.75 times 3,500. Let's say you want to gain or lose 1.5 pounds. Not recommended per week, but if that's the extent or that's the direction you want to go to, you would just multiply 3,500 times 1.5 and take that number and divide it by, you would just take 1.5 times 500, and that would be your surplus or your deficit for the day. In fact, you can go so much as start playing around with high and low days, and just start running the math. And you do that with simply that 3,500 calories is equal to 1 pound of tissue. I don't believe I've ever done high and low days when it comes to training. I don't think I was ever disciplined enough for that, but I do know some bodybuilders who they like raising their calories on their high days, reducing it on their low days, in order to, I guess, maximize where their calories are going. But we also have to take in consideration they might not be factoring in activity level. But we'll get to activity level as well when it comes to bringing this whole total equation together. Matt, you got anything to add?
Not particularly. We can move on.
Okay. So now we can move to weight gain or weight loss recommendations. So start off with weight gain recommendations. And just keep in mind, this is coming from the perspective of the goal simply being to increase muscle mass while keeping body fat as minimal as possible.
Is there a scenario in which you'd want to optimize fat gain over muscle mass?
Perhaps in some athletes, if adherence is an issue, it's not so much it's the most optimal. Well, it's not so much it's the most objectively optimal, but subjectively, perhaps they have a hard time sticking to the math. And in some cases, teenage guys or younger guys, it's easier to just say, screw the math, let me just eat unhealthy, and just I'll take the fat that comes with the muscle.
Right.
I can't really think of any scenario where adipose tissue would be preferred. I mean, there are some athletes who get a little over fat health wise, like some power lifters. But I think that's more the fact that they're trying to maximize whatever frame they have, and they've simply just determined that the extra fat is necessary for fuel or for leverages when it comes to their sport. Some would argue that they don't necessarily have to, and it's just a quicker way to get stronger. But yeah, I digress. This is a scenario where we're trying to minimize fat gain and maximize muscle gain. Isn't to say we're not going to get any fat gain, because you almost entirely always will in some type of massing stage. But if we could put it in a number, I'm using RP guidelines. Some people might say otherwise, but we'll go with this for now. Optimal muscle gain rates are somewhere between 0.25% and 0.5% of total body weight per week. And we would consider this from your starting body weight. Let's whip out my calculator real quick, and I can do it because I'm actually programming a massing phase for myself. I weigh right now 100, let's say 56 pounds times 0.00005. 5%. Yes. So 5% of my total body weight right now is 0.78 pounds. So that would be my top end of how much weight I would be wanting to put on per week if I wanted to go that way.
Is it 5% or 0.5%?
So 0.5%.
Okay.
Yeah, so that should be about 0.78 pounds if my weight is 156. So, could be wrong, but should be around there.
So
any less, and it wouldn't really make too much sense.
Rounding up to 1 pound a week, give or take.
Essentially, yeah. And so we have a rate of gain. Now we can take a look at how long it should be. For most people, 6 to 16 weeks are pretty effective. I've done 20-week masses, and honestly, at that point, it wasn't too fun. I'll get into that in a little bit. When it comes to a minimum range, a minimum of 3 weeks is pretty advisable, because any less, it makes it very much difficult to assess any progress. A pretty good reason for that is something that I actually found with myself. The minute I ever try and mass up, the first week I gain a lot of weight. A lot of that weight is me simply taking in a lot of extra carbohydrates, putting in a lot of water weight that I normally wouldn't have. So if your massing phase is anything less than 3 weeks, it's almost impossible to kind of determine, did I just gain weight in regards to tissue, or did I just gain weight because of water weight because I increased my calories or specifically my carbohydrate?
Right.
So a maximum of 24 weeks for beginners is advisable. I would say I'd put somebody on 24 weeks if they've just never touched a dumbbell before, and their only priority is really, or there should be their only priority is putting on some muscle mass. Any more than that, we run into some problems such as excess fat gain, some negative health effects, reduced training performance, and eating that much food for a long period of time, especially if you're not used to it, just starts to suck. You start feeling bloated, you start not wanting to eat, and you probably need a break and some time to pull back from the food as well as the training volume as well, because you also need sufficient amount of training to stimulate adaptations. I just want to quickly touch on something when it comes to the fat gain, to excess fat gain. There's something that we refer to as a P ratio, which is your ratio of fat to skeletal muscle. Once you start exceeding certain ranges, for men, I believe it's 20%, your ratio of fat or of weight gained past that starts inching farther and farther more towards likelihood being body fat. So if we had a sliding scale of this side being muscle mass and this side being body fat, when you first start your mass, it's pretty much over here. The majority of your weight is either probably water or skeletal muscle. The fatter you get, the more it starts shifting over towards adipose tissue. And at that point, the more adipose tissue you have, the least likely it's going to be anything else is going to be anything besides adipose tissue. And my little side note is, I believe fat cells, once you've gained fat cells, they don't go away, from what I understand. So getting over fat in a bodybuilder's off season probably isn't too beneficial because it makes future fat loss all the more difficult because those fat cells don't disappear. I may be wrong when it comes to the phrasing, but I believe I got the concept pretty much right. And then finally, we've got rates, optimal rates per week. We've got our max and minimum length. Now, how much total weight should we be looking at putting on? The upper limit for most gaining phases is about 10% of your body weight from which you began with. For more advanced individuals, you probably want to put that lower, simply because as you get more advanced when it comes to training and stuff like that, I'm talking about resistance training specifically, your potential, your ability to get new adaptations, that being skeletal muscle, kind of is not as good as when you first started. So you probably need to take it a little bit slower to make sure you're not wasting your time putting on extra fat tissue comparison to your skeletal muscle tissue. I had one more point I wanted to touch on, but I forgot it. Matt, you got anything to add?
No. Well, probably more once we get into weight loss. But yeah, for weight gain, I don't really have too much information on this. It's not really something that I've ever had to do personally or ever had to recommend. So I'm not too well versed on weight gain recommendations and guidelines.
So what I was going to say is also sometimes you have to cut your mass and your weight gain phases short simply because maybe your joints and your ligaments or your connective tissues and stuff, you start feeling beat up from your training simply for going hard for that long. Because you've given yourself a surplus, you have to do something with that surplus and you have to stimulate adaptation. If you've been going hard for that long, you might have to cut it short because you're like, my joints and connective tissues, things hurt, I need to pull back. But
Right.
These are some general recommendations to kind of go ahead when it comes to planning your massing phase. Okay, now we shift gears to weight loss. And here, our goal is we're predominantly losing body fat while minimizing muscle loss. There are some individuals who they might not care at all whatsoever if they lose extra muscle mass, whether it be for health or performance reasons. They just might need to get into a lower weight class, and they're willing to pay the price.
Yep.
I think that would be probably the most likely scenario for somebody who doesn't care about losing muscle or for health reasons. Just maybe like whatever athlete who needs to drop a weight class, and they're like, I'll just I'll take the strength hit in order to get smaller. When it comes to rates of loss, they can be anywhere from 0.5% to 1% of total body weight per week. And if you notice, they're a little bit higher than muscle gain rates. And the reason for that, it goes back to our original discussion about the body's propensity to lose and gain body fat. It's much easier to gain, and it's also easier to lose. And this is actually something that we'd want to lose in comparison to the muscle mass. So it makes a little bit more sense taking a little bit more of an aggressive approach. Not too aggressive to the point, however, that we start to lose skeletal muscle, if that's something you care about. If we exceed these rates, we can have some difficulty sustaining further fat loss. There's I forget the exact theory, but how it goes is if you start losing too aggressively, you might hit a wall essentially in regards to your fat loss, or you might hit a wall too fast and your body kind of goes into there. That's what I was thinking about. People who talk about survival mode. and your body just refuses to lose any more body weight because it knows that's not what your body naturally wants to do. It never really wants to lose weight, only when absolutely necessary. So if you know, if you turn the dial way too hard, you might just run into a wall, and you can't really drop as much as you would wanted to if you'd taken a slower route. Muscle retention is always a worry. If you try and lose too much weight too aggressively, your body might start cutting into its skeletal muscle, and your training might not be enough to signal that your body needs to keep that muscle. Long-term fitness and also health are also reasons to consider, both physical and psychological health. Dieting is never easy. Very few people enjoy it. I struggle with it every once in a while when I need to go through a fat loss phase. But yeah, those are some general recommendations. So now we have the percentages per week. Now, when we're looking at lengths of diet phases, we can look at 6 to 12 weeks being relatively the sweet spot for most individuals. A minimum of 3 weeks is pretty advisable, as again, it's pretty difficult to differentiate between water weight and fat loss periods for any less time. Usually for me, it takes about 1 week for me even to determine if I've lost fat, maybe 1 to 2 weeks before I've determined if I'm just losing fat, or because I've dropped my carbs so low, I'm just water depleted for the most part. So yeah, anything less than 3 weeks, and you might be kind of spinning your wheels for no reason. A maximum of 12 to 16 weeks of dieting is pretty advisable, as chances of declining adherence and rebound weight gain kind of start increasing steeply after this point. Similar to gaining weight, there are, some stipulations, or not stipulations, but there's some downsides. With gaining weight, the downside is it gets pretty hard to keep stuffing that food over extended period of time. Well, with weight loss, it just becomes hard keeping your calories as low as you want them to over an extended period of time. Now, when we go to the upper limit, it's also 10% of your total starting body weight. If I did it for myself, it would be 156 times 0.1. My maximum amount of weight would be 15.6 pounds. Personally, I would never even get close to trying to aim for that amount of fat loss, because I know myself. I after reading my body and understanding over an extended period of time, I know I would start tapping into some skeletal muscle. I've done it before, and it's put me back when it comes to my progress. Something that isn't involved when it really comes to weight gain phases is having recovery periods afterwards, after the phase is done, which is more involved when it comes to fat loss periods. In regards to your maintenance phase after you've done your diet, it should probably last 2/3 the length of the weight loss phase. So if you dieted for 12 weeks, your recovery phase should probably last 8 weeks afterwards, where you eat at isocaloric. And it's kind of recommended before starting another weight loss phase, in order to kind of give yourself a psychological break, allow the body to resensitize to the effects of a calorie deficit, and kind of recover from any negative effects that you may have.
Right.
Something that I forgot to mention is, for weight gain and weight loss, you can run multiple phases interspersed with maintenance periods in betweens whenever you feel like you need a break. So with weight loss, we have some actually set determinant factors in regards to how long you should wait before you hop in again. With weight gain, probably not too many. I would still maybe do like 1 4-week, 4 or 5-week trading block to kind of resensitize, get in your groove again, get used to eating normally, and then kind of push again. Okay. Matt, you were going to say something?
No, sorry. I just half the recording is going to be missing because I ran out of space on my hard drive. But that's fine. I'll just grab the VOD off Twitch. It's no big deal. Okay. Something also that I did want to add. Is there gonna be any kind of performance hit that an athlete might experience if they are on a weight loss path? How is that going to affect their athletic performance? Because obviously they are still going to be doing whatever activity, exercise, sport, whatever it is they're doing while they're doing this. So is there any sort of negative effect that going on a weight loss plan could sort of show up in their general performance?
I think the first thing we would have to discuss determine is, why is the athlete doing it? Do they believe that their current level of weight is suboptimal for their sport? Do they need to hit a new weight? weight cap, what stage of the season are they in.
Right.
I think those are the first things you would have to talk with the athlete about as to why they're doing it. Because overall, in general, losing weight while being an athlete pretty much results in shittier performance overall. So it would have to be some pretty niche specific reasons as to why you are doing it, especially if it's in season.
So
In regards
ideally,
to
if you were to be doing it, it would be on the off season. You wouldn't want to be doing that during
100%.
competition.
100%, you wouldn't be unless you absolutely have to.
So it was
For the
essential.
most part, yeah.
Okay.
Let's say we have an athlete. I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a professional sports athlete who came into the season a little over fat, and would have had to play through that. James Harden. I think that's a decent example. He came in a little chubbier. There's a couple soccer players I know. Eden Hazard for Real Madrid came back a little bit chubbier than he'd want to at the beginning of the season, but they lost it over time. But again, back to what you were saying, performance definitely decreases in strength, in maximal strength, speed, power, endurance, whole 9 yards for the most part. Less severe at first, more severe as the deficit kind of keeps getting more serious over time. At that point, I don't know why the athlete would continue it, but let's say they do. As we spoke earlier, tissue repair becomes compromised for the most part. Maybe some injuries start popping up. If they're in a calorie deficit, their carbohydrate is probably a little bit low, which we'll discuss why that's important. So their performance probably isn't doing too well. Overall, just not a good state for any athlete to really be in, to be in a chronic deficit overall
Right.
for general health, quality of life, and just your success as an athlete, unless you absolutely have to. Yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. Well, shall we move on then?
All right, so to kind of finish off with calories, we've provided recommendation. Well, why you want to do them, why you want to care about them, calculation parameters, optimal gain rates, how to set it up. Now let's kind of talk about some just general practical tips. So, something that I use is I have a Fitbit, and I honestly only use this Fitbit. My girlfriend got it for me. Thank you, Malaya. Love you lots. I primarily use it simply for tracking steps. And the reason I do that is it gives me some kind of like quantifiable number that I can assign calories towards, rather than just kind of looking at my day and being like, this was like a light active day, medium active day. So with my steps, I can actually assign some rough, a little bit more accurate numbers in regards to how much expenditure I've gotten from just general walking across the day. Of course, there's going to be other stuff such as us simply doing this podcast using my brain. Your brain burns quite a bit of glucose. All uses calories as well, so I can't really physically count for that, but this is a really good way of accounting for that. If you have a step counter or a smartwatch, I think the actual term is like a pedometer, I would just look at the steps. When it comes to how many calories it actually tells me it's burning, I forget the equation it uses. I'm learning it right now in one of my classes, but if somebody were to tell me like I've burned my step counter has told me I've burned 1,615 calories today, which would put me in a pretty serious deficit. All I've done today is do a midterm, work on the podcast, and eat some food. I would be very hard pressed to believe that. And if anybody told me, I'd have to call bullshit on that as well. Why they're so inaccurate? I honestly don't know. I actually have no idea why they are so inaccurate. From what I understand, Apple Watches are a little bit better, but I guess what I would do is I pull up a pedometer chart that kind of illustrates calories to steps based on my weight. Matt, I'm gonna actually get you to pull it up if you can. I don't know. Can you show websites while we're streaming?
Yes and no. It's just I have to make a few adjustments. What are you trying to pull up here?
It's honestly the website that I used. Thank you. You don't really have to pull it up. What's the chart that I use? It is steps to calorie pedometer chart.
I got the
I can't find
formula
it for
for
what
it.
there is a formula. I'm not sure if I trust the formula so much, but if for the audience, I forget exactly where I found my chart. I should have that on hand.
There's a bunch of calculators.
There's a bunch of calculators. I'm not sure if I would really take those too much. Oh, here it is. Verywellfit.com. That's the chart that I use for
It's
the
like the
most part.
second result that comes up when you type in steps to calorie formula.
Essentially, yeah. And I've been using that for a little bit with some decent success. I will go to kind of weight range, the minimum number of steps, which is 1,000 calories, and the estimated amount of calories per 1,000 steps. I'll divide that number by 1,000 by that number, and it'll give me my projected steps to calories. For me, I've kind of determined it to be around 29, 32, somewhere around there, and that's how I kind of determined how my calories to steps are going to be calculated. And that's what I've been moving forward with myself and two other clients that I've been doing, and so far, relatively accurate. So my process is, by the end of the day, I kind of get a good idea, or I'll set myself a step goal. I will do my math. Let's say, however, 1,000. Say I do 10,000 steps. For me, that's somewhere like 4 something or 500 calories. I'll record that in my fitness pal, like 500 calories of extra energy, and then boom, I have an idea of how many extra calories I should be consuming based on my goal. So that's one thing. And the second thing I would also recommend is if you train, some pedometers or some calorie trackers, also track how much calories you're burning through your workout, which also debatable in regards to accuracy. For me, an average resistance training session, I'll just put a set number of maybe 200 to 300 calories. It doesn't have to be accurate. That's usually the typical rough number of calories. I think it's found to be assigned to something like that. But as long as you are, taking into account that every session is probably not too much more difficult than the other one. As you progress through a training block or a season, things start to get harder, so you might have to up it. But as long as you assign some type of variable that's somewhat fixed, and then put it into your kind of overall calorie tracking, you shouldn't be too far off from kind of noticing some trends. So that's my recommendations when it comes to tracking hard to track, I guess, forms of energy expenditure. And my method is I would simply add these onto either straight to my BMR or how many calories a calorie calculator would predict I would be burning if I did, nothing in a day, but just general activity. And from there, you can kind of start learning your body, and then write things down, get an idea of where you're resting, your usual settling calories are, and then move from there. Which is pretty much what happens for most people who start doing this for an extended period of time. You just start to learn. Right. And that's honestly the hardest part, is actually wrapping your head around calculations and then realizing like, oh, this was all just a hypothesis that I have to experiment with, mess around with, make mistakes, and eventually kind of get to it. Rambled on a little bit, but I have one final thing really when it comes to calorie counting, is that you don't necessarily have to dive head first into calorie tracking. I know for myself, it's very simple just due to my circumstances. My mom cooks a decent amount of my meals. My meals are fairly consistent. I eat very simple. I make my life easy for myself when it comes to being on track with my stuff. For people who are much busier, who necessarily can't cook all the time, who have to eat out more, becomes a little bit more stressful, a little bit more difficult. And honestly, calorie tracking over an extended period of time can be pretty psychologically draining for the most part. So it's definitely something you should take breaks away from. For me, I take on my deloads where my calories are isocaloric, I stop, and during my maintenance months or training periods, I don't track at all, just to kind of give myself a breather and I learned the skill of eyeballing things for myself, which for most people should probably be the eventual goal.
Right.
Just eyeballing and learning how to be I would say be in a surplus or at maintenance. Dieting while eyeballing can be very difficult, but it can be done, but it probably requires a little bit more discipline, and it can be clouded by just the cognitive impairment of just dieting, period. But
yeah,
again, some people that I've worked with or I've talked to, they'll maybe do 2 days a week tracking, and the rest are kind of eyeballing, then up it, then up it, then up it, until they feel like they've gotten the skill down and then pull back. You don't need to be successful. I would just say it's a really good tool if you want to at least get a starting point and a grip on what you're doing. Because otherwise, if you are trying to make adjustments to your diet by simply eyeballing, you just don't have the skills to know. After maybe like a couple months, or for me 4 years, if you took away my scale for a year, I think within maybe 200 calories I would maybe get it right. But it's simply maybe I definitely need to pull back from and practice the skill of non-weighing dieting.
Right.
I don't know, Matt. Do you got anything to add to that? Any experience?
Not particularly. I think we've more or less summed up the basics here of calorie intake and management.
Okay.
So with that being said, do you want to move on to macros here?
Yes, sir. We're like an hour and a half in, so let's get to this second part. So,
okay.
for the audience wondering,
Yeah.
calories, again, the most important real part when it comes to body composition for athletes, general population, physique competitors. So obviously that talk took a while, but if you get that right, if you get your calories done, you're 50% of the way to getting a decent control of your body composition.
So let's get into macronutrients here. Now, I guess macronutrients, for those wondering, are going to be the I'm going to call them the big three, because really they are the big three when we're talking about nutrient tracking and what people tend to always look at. It's going to be that carbohydrate, that protein, and that fat, right? Those are going to be your big three. And that's going to be a large chunk of our diet. Everything we eat is going to have those, and it's going to mostly be the influence, right? So I'll just briefly, I'm not going to go too deep into the individual bodily functions of what each macro does, just because in terms of how it relates to performance, it's not super necessary. I want to start with carbohydrates. We've talked about this a lot, essentially what the functions of carbohydrates are. It is going to be your body's main source of energy. So carbohydrates, anywhere from your grains, your sugars, that glucose and glycogen that we talk about.
I just want to quickly jump in and just say, when it comes to macros, in regards to body composition, it probably recommends, it takes up 25% of the total equation. So if you combine calories and macros, we have 75% of what's going on. So that's pretty much a summary of the, if it fits your macros or IFYM diet or something like that. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. So, and in terms of like your body's use for carbohydrates, they're like, again, when we talk about that glucose and that glycogen, carbohydrates are readily available. It's what sort of our body can access the fastest. That's why we talked about weight loss and sort of the different, what am I thinking? The mechanics, the techniques. When we talk about using up all those carbohydrates first and then getting into that fat loss, because carbohydrates are going to be that primary source, right? It's what we can access the fastest. So how we can sort of, I guess, break that down into percentages is when we talk about our AMDRs, which, what does AMDR stand for? It's average something daily recommendation, right?
Yeah.
Basically the average percentage of calories that it should make up. So when we talk about carbohydrates, you want carbohydrates to sort of occupy 45 to 60% of those daily calories. So again, that daily calorie intake that we calculated with our BMR and our Harris-Benedict equations and all the sort of different ways that we can track our calories, we want 45 to 65% of those to be from carbohydrates. And how you can track that yourself is just by knowing that there's 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, right? So let's say I wish I had a nutrient facts like a label that all foods
You have
should
me.
have.
The pita I ate beforehand had 27 grams of carbs.
27 grams of carbs. Okay, so to figure out exactly what that would be, that would just be 4 times 27. That's how many calories from carbohydrates you got from that meal, which is, David with a calculator.
Of course.
4 times 27. Where are we at?
108. The total pita was 150 calories. From what I remember, had a decent amount of sugar as well. So that's where the rest would come from.
Right. So yeah, we're looking at that, and that's how you can sort of obviously, one pita is not enough to make up 45 to 60% of your daily caloric intake. But you do that calculation, you add up all of the carbs that you are eating throughout the day, doing that calculation to try and fit yourself in between that 45 to 65%. Moving on to our second macro here, we've got protein. I'm sure lots of people are familiar with protein. You may not even necessarily know the precise function of protein or exactly why it's important, but you do know that you do need protein. Again, these three macronutrients, they are the big three. They are what your body needs the most of to function. So we talk about protein and just the basic role of protein in our body. Basically, protein it's gonna help us with a bunch of different things on a molecular level when we talk about just baseline bodily functions. But in regards to training and fitness, protein's biggest, I guess, use that people are going to be using protein for is muscle mass, building muscle mass. That protein synthesis, which is the process of muscle building, is basically going to be increasing that skeletal muscle. When we talk about AMDRs for protein, you want it to occupy, again, 10 to 35% of your daily calorie intake, and very similar to carbohydrates, it's also 4 calories per gram. So if we talk about what's something that is, do you have on hand anything that might be high in protein or no?
150 grams of chicken breast is about 41 grams of protein.
41
As you
grams
can
of
see,
protein. So
audience, I've been doing this for a while.
yeah. So we talk about
Around
41
it.
times 4, that is 164. 164 gram or 164 calories rather. So when we talk about that, obviously again, a chicken breast is not going to be enough to occupy that 10 to 35%, although it might be actually pretty close, depending on where your caloric balance needs to be, which is going to obviously vary based on who you are and the BMR calculation that we did. But yeah, within that 10 to 35% range. Moving to the last macronutrient we have here, we've got fat. Now, this is honestly something that you still obviously need to be aware of based on what we talked about, calorie intake and how to manage that fat gain, fat loss. But fat really doesn't have a purpose when it comes to athletic performance. We use carbs and protein mostly, in fact, almost exclusively, as our fuel sources, as our recovery mechanisms. Fat does have its purpose within the body. It does do stuff. You got fat for insulation, like I was talking about before. Throughout history, cold weather, our body needs fat. All that stuff. I think make like cell makeup and a whole bunch of other things. Fat has its use. So because of that, you do want it to occupy, when we talk about AMDR here for fat, is 20 to 35%. Now, unlike carbs and protein, there's actually going to be 9 calories per gram when it comes to fat. So we talk about something that's high in fat. Do you have any values off the top for fat based on common foods here?
Oh wait, sardines.
Sardines, okay.
So anybody's wondering, I've incorporated sardines into my diet because I wanted to increase my fat intake. What's it called? For like 150 grams of like sardine fillet, it's like 200 grams is 600 calories. It's dense. It's extremely dense.
Yikes.
Fat-wise, I believe it's 20 grams of fat.
20 grams of fat.
And like 18 grams of protein. Something like that.
Okay, so 20 grams, and then you just multiply that by the 9 calories, which is... I can't do that mentally, even though I probably should be able to do that mentally.
Of course, I have the calculator.
I'm so dumb. It would be like, what?
180.
Yeah, I was.
Wait.
No. Yes, yeah, it should be.
Yes,
it should be 180. Damn,
yes.
I should have been able to do that mentally. That's embarrassing. Yeah. So 180 calories coming from your fat sources. Again, you want
I definitely had more fat when I was looking at the math, but you guys kind of get the picture.
Yeah, you want it to be within that 20 to 35% range, and you just want to balance. Like, unless we are trying to, like we talked about before, you don't want to be gaining weight. When we're gaining weight, we're really aiming for muscle gain, not fat gain. So at least being able to balance making sure you're not getting more than 35% of your calories from fat is going to help you stay within that limit. So
Aside from just like performance reasons, also general health.
yeah,
Once you start accumulating large amounts of dietary fat, you do run into risks in the sense that I'll touch back on healthy and non-healthy fats, but the majority of people get their fats from trans and saturated fat, which we're looking at probably being the research is a little iffy on saturated fat, but definitely trans fat is not the healthiest, and you start running into a lot of issues later down the line, like cardiovascular disease, stuff like that, by having a chronically high fat intake as well as a chronically probably high calorie intake as well.
yeah. All right, so I guess similar to the title that we've got going here, how does this relate to performance? Whether you're an athlete or just somebody who goes to the gym and works out, how can we take these values, these macronutrients, and apply them to maximize the performance? So what I've got here for us today is just a general guideline. Oh, take that off. Take that off. Nope. Hold on. I got this. Okay, there we go. All right. So I've got some tables here. So I'm not going to go over everything that's here because there is a lot of words here, a lot of numbers, but I have kind of gone through and it's just kind of highlighted what's important to note here. So at the top here, again, we have that Harris-Benedict equation, which figured out our BMR. But let's go into our daily considerations. So this is just general daily considerations as an athlete. We talk about carbohydrates, which CHO, that's your molecular formula for carbohydrates, that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. But CHO, carbohydrate, it's obviously going to be based around your general activity level. But for most athletes who are going to be in that moderate to high carbohydrate utilization, we're looking at, let's say you're moderate, looking at 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. So that's kilograms in regards to body weight for how much you need. So 5 to 7 grams per kilogram, if you're in that high range, so if you are doing 1 to 3 hours of moderate to high intensity, depending on your sport, depending on your activity, your routine at the gym, this might apply. You're looking at that 6 to 10 range. So I would say anywhere between 5 to 10 grams per kilogram for your generic average athlete or gym goer. We flip over to protein. So according to Dietitians of Canada, there are different figures here based on different researches that have been done. The ones I'm choosing to go with here are Dietitians of Canada, is 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram. Now, if you are looking for daily protein intake recommendations, you are going to see the 0.8 number come up a lot, which 0.8 grams per kilogram is going to be that general recommended amount for your average person. But we're talking about athletic performance, physical performance. So for those types of people here, we're looking at, again, 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram. And we talk about fat daily intake. You don't want your daily intake to be, again, we talked about that 20 to 35%. So you don't want it to be any less than 20% of your overall calories. Again, we still want fat. We just don't want too much of it. So no more than 35% of your overall calorie intake.
I would say that the best way to go about it is saying we want the minimum number of fat that does not take away from the advantages we get from having more protein and more carbohydrate.
Correct.
That's essentially the balance we're playing with.
Right.
Enough fat for health reasons, but carbohydrate and protein, especially carbohydrate, are much more suited towards performance.
All right. And then I've got some recommendations here for water and actually sodium balance as well. I wouldn't say that these are necessarily that important. Well, water is important. Sodium balance, I wouldn't worry too much about unless you really want to get into it. But for water, general recommendation, they say every pound of body weight lost is 500 milliliters of fluid you need to replenish. That being said, not everyone's going to be able to measure how many pounds of body weight they've lost in a workout. So I would just say, again, as a general recommendation, for your athlete, like I've got my 4-liter jug here. David's got something similar as well.
I think mine's 2.
Yeah.
1.8, 1.9.
So I would say for your active athlete, it's going to obviously depend on body weight, all that kind of, all those external factors. But I would say as a general recommendation, anywhere between 4 to 8 liters of water. So for reference, that's going to be 1 to 2 of these big jugs a day, which
You say 4 to 8?
I said 4 to 8. So for you,
This is
that's like
what?
what,
2 to 4 of these?
2 to 4 of those a day.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, for anyone who can see the visual size of the jugs that we have, that probably seems like a lot, but it is a lot, and that is what your body needs. It can be shocking to really know, but if you want to perform optimally and at your max, that kind of hydration, that kind of water intake is necessary. So that's just our daily considerations. I want to move on here to sort of pre-workout considerations, pre-training, pre-competition. So this is kind of where macro intake gets a little bit more useful in terms of knowledge and how much you need to take and when you need to take it. So I would say out of the three, the most important one when we talk about pre-training, pre-competition is going to be carbohydrates. I'm sure a lot of people have kind of heard especially when it comes to endurance athletes, like, oh, eat some carbs, eat like pasta or spaghetti the night before. The reason for that is, again, our body is using that glucose, that glycogen, that carbohydrate, and we want to ideally load as much of that as we can into our body before it's used, so it has an adequate amount, sort of a bank to draw from to start using that. But if that's not sort of within your diet, obviously that's if you have a serious competition coming up. But just for general pre-training competition considerations, I would say 1 to 4 grams per kilogram, based on, again, individuality and in context with how much carbohydrate you've already had during the day. Like if you're in that upper range already, moderate it. That's why I say 1 to 4 and in context, but at least 1 gram per kilogram as a minimum. In terms of the other macronutrients here, I wouldn't say protein has any impact to pre-training, as well as fat. Fat has no impact on performance during competition, during training. I would just say that, yeah, it can delay digestion of other nutrients and potentially lead to some gastrointestinal discomfort. So I would kind of skew away from fat, but if you have to take it, all of these are going to be in that 1 to 4 hours before you train or you compete. That is the optimal time to take it. We talk about taking water or drinking water. Not super important during this phase. We're looking at 5 to 10 milliliters per kilogram, approximately 2 to 4 hours, but like I said, not super important. Just use your urine color as a guide. If it's looking kind of yellow, then you're a little bit dehydrated. You might want to top up. If it's coming out clear, then you're good. You're good to go here. So
like a small little disclaimer, I guess, with the urine thing is, if you're taking a multivitamin, you might be skewing your urine color simply because if you already are getting enough nutrients, your piss might come out various different colors. Usually it's a good indication. If it's coming out like neon yellow, you are probably just peeing your money away and you've already gotten your nutrients. But that's just a little disclaimer. If you're drinking a lot of water and your pee is always yellow, you might just be eating something random that has a high amounts of some type of micronutrient, or your multivitamin might just be a waste of money right now.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, that's all really to it.
Now I would say let's get into during here. So we've got pre and daily. Let's talk about what you should be doing. Oh, I need to resize this. Let's talk about what you should be doing during exercise and during competition. So whether you're at the gym and you just need to top up on something, or you're in the middle of a game, or whatever competition you're running, biking, anything like this. So again, carbohydrates is going to be your big one here. This is what you want to be topping up because this is what your body is going to be trying to access for fuel. So the general guidelines, if you want to sort of maintain glycogen stores, is 0.5 to 1 gram of carbs per minute for just training sessions, competitions that could be limited by decreasing glycogen stores, which is basically anything. I can't think of any activity particularly that's not going to be fairly reliant on using that glycogen, and
unless you've already depleted your glycogen, which would be the rare exception of some endurance athletes,
right,
who have exceeded 2 hours of continuous activity.
Right. And sort of to put it into context perspective here, when we do deplete that glycogen, That's known as hitting the wall, and I'm sure any endurance athlete will tell you that that wall exists, where you come up against that wall and it does not feel like you can go any further. Now, when we talk about discipline and being a good athlete, it's being able to push over that wall and keep going, but you are like working in that decreasing glycogen scenario, which is not ideal. And if you can, we follow that guideline of zero point 0.5 to 1 gram of carbs per minute. Easiest way to do this, which I do like to recommend, is like hard candy. Hard candy, again, you can.
About my recommendation as well. If ideally, when it comes to your intra workout, you'd probably want it to be a fluid because it's a little bit more ideal for digestion.
Right.
Dextrose powder, which is literally just pure glucose, it's sugar.
Mm-hmm.
If you can find it, it works. Something during COVID, I've been trying to find myself some dextrose powder for my own intra workout.
Yeah.
I've just kind of gone straight to like little Tang packets. You guys know what that is? It's literally just like that.
It's like
that
concentrated
vitamin C sugar.
Yeah.
And it works. It's not the same, but it works essentially the same. Remember that glucose is essentially sugar. It's not chemical. There's some technicalities here and there, but it's still pretty much pure carbohydrate. So it should work just as well. If not, everybody's familiar with like Gatorade and Powerade. Those are all digest extremely quickly as well.
Yep.
Electrolytes, all that type of fun stuff.
Which, like, again, you might see marathon runners having those little like gel packets, or like gel cubes, which, well, David knows I was honestly addicted to for a while, just because they're really they're really tasty. But they also just do the job in replacing those glycogen stores. The gel packets are honestly kind of nasty though. I tried them just to see what they were like, and they were kind of gross. But I'd rather much go with like the little gel gummy cubes. But anything that's going to be digested quickly as glucose, as glycogen, is going to be ideal for replacing the glycogen that is being decreased.
A quick little note as well is when we say digesting, we're not just simply going through your stomach, coming out, just coming out as just excreting it afterwards. We're talking about it just being absorbed by the bloodstream extremely quickly. When it's absorbed into the bloodstream, it's taken to where it needs to be. If you're an endurance athlete or whatever type of athlete, probably to the muscles that are being used.
Yeah, and just going back to the guidelines, this is going to be good for anything typically lasting longer than an hour. So, if it's a long gym session, or again, a lot of sports games will go over longer than an hour where you are working. It's going to be on and off again, depending on your sport. But just keeping in mind that general guideline, moving to protein, there really, again, isn't any use for protein during training. That's going to come afterwards when we talk about protein synthesis and muscle mass gain, which I'll go into in just a second here. And again, fat, not recommended. It digests very slow, but
we'll slow down other things as well that are being digested.
Yeah, and we'll slow down other digestive factors. When we talk about water, this is going to be extremely important because you are going to be dehydrating yourself through sweat, through bodily functions, right? You are going to be excreting that water, so you want to replace what's coming out always to kind of maintain that hydration balance. So the general guideline for me is 250 milliliters every 15 minutes. You might want to consider body weight monitoring to develop a personalized strategy. So kind of just like realistic. So don't just be like, oh, I need 4 liters of fluids, even if that does correlate to the amount of weight that you lost. Keep it within context to your own body weight. But yeah, as a general guideline, 250 mils every 15 minutes. That's going to, for the most part, keep you hydrated. So water is, I would say, is the best way to do that. But we use Gatorade, we use other kinds of sport drinks that are going to have that sugar, that sodium that we're also going to be depleting. So in this instance, this is the time to drink Gatorade. Like, you'll see people, and honestly, I'm guilty of it, drinking Gatorade when, they're not excreting that water, that sodium, all that stuff. In which case, you're just getting an excess, right? You don't want an excess of sugar. You want to replace the glucose that is being lost. You want to replace the sodium that is being lost. You never want to add it in excess. That's where you're going wrong. So if you are going to be doing, like, drinking Gatorade, make sure you're using that during training, during exercise, during a competition, not honestly, you could probably use Gatorade as well after the fact as well as a recovery, but typically you want to be recovering as you're training. You want to be replenishing as you go. It's a little bit easier on your body.
I would say maybe like the rare instance where an athlete requires like actually not even rare. I remember doing this. You know those like all day tournaments.
Yeah,
At that point, you want as much like fast digesting carbohydrate as you possibly
like
can,
yeah, you want to keep
and
it going.
yeah, as well as much as I guess fast digesting protein and carbohydrate as much as you can.
Yeah,
Not to fill your stomach and feel satiated, but so much just keep your performance going. Because I remember those tournaments where by like my second game, my second soccer game, I'd be like, I'm dead. I want to go home.
right. All right, so let's go into post exercise here. Now, this is a big one. This is very important when we talk about post exercise macro intake. So, carbohydrates. There's not a lot of use for carbs after the fact. The only thing you'd want to be like eating carbs for afterwards is to top up on that glucose and glycogen that you used. So if you want to be doing that, you want to be doing that within sort of the first hour to 2 hours post competition, post training. The reason for that is when our body is able to digest, and when like digest at a quicker rate, so that glycogen uptake is going to occur at a much faster rate within that first 1 hour to 2 hours. But really, the only reason why we'd want to be doing this is to recover our glycogen stores. And for endurance athletes, as long as 24 hours exists between your first exercise and any subsequent exercise, there's really no advantage to consuming carbohydrates immediately after exercise. It's really only when you go into like less than 24 hours. So like, let's say you just finished a race and you have a race later on that day, then it does make a lot of sense for you to be consuming carbs in that 1 to 2 hour window, that time frame there.
I think I will say though there is a slight caveat when it comes to individuals who are very interested when it comes to physique sports and stuff like that. Your post training carbohydrate is important in the sense that you do again same thing. You want to replenish your glycogen stores as well, but you definitely want to pick a high glycemic. Simply for a couple of different physiological reasons. Carbohydrate is very anabolic. It's very anti-catabolic, so it does help with muscle protein synthesis, all that type of fun stuff. So you do want to combine that with a also high, quick digesting protein to, I guess, satisfy that anabolic window. I don't really want to get into that because there's a couple misconceptions, a lot of stuff going on. But for general physique sports and stuff like that, definitely top up your prioritize your carbohydrate intro, and post. That's what I'll say.
Right.
At least for today's talk.
And we are getting towards the end here, so I'll quickly wrap it up with our post training. So we went over carbohydrates and sort of exactly when and why we should be taking carbs, or rather shouldn't be taking carbs, or don't need to take carbs after a workout or competition. This one is the big one, protein. So after we exercise, this is when the majority of our protein synthesis, so our muscle building, is going to occur. And evident in the name, we need protein to stimulate protein synthesis. Now, there's a few theories about sort of timing and how to do this. The one that I'm familiar with is basically called the muscle full effect. What this means is that protein synthesis, so that muscle building, is going to reach its like highest, I guess, optimal rate around
absorption.
Around 2 hours after you ingest protein. And sort of the maximum amount you want to stimulate, not the maximum amount, but the amount that you want to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis and this muscle full effect, is going to be this 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram. Basically, that's going to be the amount that you want to not necessarily enhance, but make sure that protein synthesis is working at its best. That's kind of the value that you want to ingest to push protein synthesis to make that muscle full effect occur. If we're talking about in a graph sense, obviously the graph goes up, you hit that max, that's when we have muscle full effect, that's when the most protein synthesis is occurring, and then it slowly starts to decline. This is the most important, I guess, post training macro, simply because most people are training for that muscle growth, right? even if you're not, you still want protein synthesis to occur, or at the very least, like we want protein balance, which protein is going to help stimulate as well, right? At no point do we want to be losing protein. That's when we get into atrophy and talking about like your body does not want to be using protein as a fuel source. That's again when atrophy occurs, and talk about like malnutrition, when people are starting to lose muscle mass because their body is eating away at their protein stores and not their fat, not their carbohydrates.
I will add, when it comes to any athlete or any individual trying to play around with their protein intake, when in doubt, spread it out evenly.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway, because it has been shown that muscle protein synthesis, it's, from what I understand, after a training session, it's not just simply elevated for within that day, but after several, I think it was a Schoenfeld study as well. Funny enough that's there, that it's elevated over like 1 or 2 days afterwards. So the whole anabolic window is not bullshit in regards to protein feeding, but it's probably more optimal to just have it more spaced out over more frequent meals, rather than just being like, okay, I have 180 grams of protein to eat today. I'm going to put 80 grams in my post-workout meal, 30 grams in one meal, 30 grams in another one, and then 10 in another one. Right. You know? At that 80, you've probably reached the peak of absorption, and at that point, you're kind of not wasting your protein, but it could be more optimally spaced out more evenly throughout the day. Not a massive deal, but I always say, when in doubt, just space it out.
Yeah.
All right.
Nice. So, we talk about fat intake. Again, this has no really considerations over post-training. Just making sure we're staying within the amount that our body needs in terms of calorie balance. But yeah, fat for pretty much all stages of training and competition is not going to have any performance boost. In fact, it might actually hamper when we talk about causing slow digestion. So you do want to stay away from fatty foods during this whole cycle here. And then water, again, I talked about 1 pound of body weight loss is equivalent to 500 milliliters of fluid. Not everyone is going to be aware of how much body weight they lost. I would just bring it back to the point of work within your own context. Know that you're probably going to want to prescribe yourself that 4 to 8 liters. Use your urine color as an example. Obviously, there are some variations with what your urine color looks like, but for the most part, it is going to be a fairly good identifier of where you're at hydration wise. And then sodium, not super important. When we talked about sodium and water balance, sodium is going to like draw that water out. That's just kind of chemically what it does. So you want to be kind of aware of how much sodium you're replenishing, because you don't want to screw up your water balance too much. I think Gatorade works fine. It's got that sodium, it's got that electrolytes. If you are looking for a post-workout recovery drink, I would say like any sports drink is going to be designed for that purpose. So you can't really go wrong. Obviously, I would say water over everything else, but if you do need it, yeah, that Gatorade, Powerade, what have you, is going to have all of those required macro and micronutrients that you need for recovery and replenishing your body. But with that being said, do you have anything to add, David?
I think we covered calories fairly well. We went over, I'd say we went over like the basics of macronutrients. I definitely have a lot more that I have prepared to talk about when it comes to macronutrients, but we've hit 2 hours, so it can definitely be saved for another episode where maybe we go in a little bit more in depth and then kind of continue on. I don't know if you still have the pyramid up. You can pop that up real quick.
Yeah, let me pull it up.
I guess this is a series now. We didn't really plan on this being a series, but considering there's so much to talk about nutrition, we'll move on to I guess maybe come back and maybe touch on a little bit more when it comes to macros. Move on. We did touch on nutrient timing, but I also have quite a lot of other things I would like to add when it comes to like the nitty gritty of it. Food composition also pretty important, and then we've already kind of touched on supplements and hydration. I don't think there's much more, but I have like 1 or 2 things also to add to that we can do in a different episode, and hopefully either not in the next one or in the subsequent one, we can kind of wrap it all together and maybe do an experiment where we assemble a diet together on like a spreadsheet or something, and kind of give the audience an idea of like, how to organize to the best of your abilities as, I guess, an amateur when it comes to diving.
Right.
You know, that's what I would think maybe the future of our next 2 or 3 episodes, or 1 or 2 episodes, could look like.
Yeah. All right, so let's wrap it up then. Uh, Thank you everyone who's either watching on Twitch, YouTube. My recording, like I said, died halfway through, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get the audio version of this unless I can. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to get the audio version of this, unfortunately. That being said, though, yeah, check us out on Twitch, Mattis TTV, YouTube, Fitness Decoded. I should have a link to the YouTube channel in my channel about section. You just gotta click